Okay, so let us slowly get started. I'll begin the recording. Okay, somebody has started the recording. Thank you. We will. So what we are looking at currently is the problem of atomic spectra. So over the last two lectures, we set up the problem. So the problem is as follows. Classical mechanically. So of course, all those uh, incidental problems about whether electrons existed inside atoms, etc., etc., they slowly got chipped away. Somebody raised their hand. Do they have a question? All right. Yeah. And once these problems got solved and people started believing that atoms were made of electrons, which were the same as the cathode ray particles, it became very apparent that given the neutrality of the atom, the atoms, the electrons had to be counterbalanced in charge by a positive charge. And people came up with two prominent models. J.J. Thomson came up with his what is called the Jellium model, where or the watermelon model, depending on um, the place you come from, it's known from with different names. But the idea is there is a smeared out charge density of positive charge, and these electrons are embedded statically in this matrix of positive charge so as to achieve an overall neutrality of the atom. And he also included a size factor which made the atom have a certain size which agreed with the data from kinetic theory of gases and other experiments. The other model was by Nagaoka, which was also confirmed as the correct model of the atom by Geiger and Marsden's experiments and Rutherford's theoretical calculations. So this is the model that was proven to be the actual model, and this one has a central extremely tiny volume which has a positive charge, and the electrons are around this positive charge. And the moment this sort of a structure came into mind, people who were familiar with gravity by then for close to 4 centuries immediately thought up a planetary model, and electrons are attracted to a point positive charge exactly like the using a Coulomb's force, which goes exactly functionally as 1 over r, similar to a gravitational potential. And in this model, which is a very for two bodies, if you consider the hydrogen atom, there is one electron and one positive charge. So for these two body problem, it is exactly soluble. And borrowing the solution from the planetary scenario, we know already that these electrons have to be going around in planar orbits, planar as in the orbits are confined to a particular plane within the atom, and different electrons could be going in different planes, that is okay, but they are confined to one particular, each electron is confined to one particular plane. And depending on whether the electron is going around in an elliptic orbit or a circular orbit, the electron's trajectory can be written as either in a Fourier series like we discussed last time, and this Fourier series necessarily from a mathematical perspective has only a discretely infinite set of components, and this discrete infinity of components has a fundamental frequency and its higher harmonics. So there is some nu naught, and then there is n times nu naught, where n can be 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. It's the set of positive integers. And this immediately posed certain problems. Atomic spectra were not seen, measured to have any such harmonic relationship. We know wavelength and frequency are related, So if you look at the frequencies of these atomic spectral lines, those frequencies don't follow any such harmonic series. In fact, a few people like Balmer, Lyman, and others had already worked hard to compute some numerical formulae which exactly describe at least a set of these wavelengths, and that itself was a very remarkable result, which kind of indicated that there was a background theory which may be able to explain this behavior. But clearly, the notion of a trajectory which has a Fourier series expansion in terms of a fundamental frequency and its higher harmonics was increasingly becoming untenable. This was the place where we stopped last time, and we will now look at how Niels Bohr went about solving this problem of atomic spectra over a period of close to 20 years, starting from around 1905 to about 1925. This era truly belongs to Niels Bohr. Okay, so what were some of the observations that Niels Bohr made? The first observation is the one made by Balmer. Balmer in 1884. He predicted that a few lines, which at that point of time were called the H alpha, beta, gamma, and delta lines of the hydrogen spectrum, they had, by pure mathematical jugglery, he found out that these had frequencies which were, they had a very strange but regular form like this. So it was not very difficult to notice that the numerators were all perfect squares, and lambda naught was some 3645.6 angstroms. This was his observation, and he even cooked up a formula which said n squared minus 4, and this agreed very well for these 4 lines. And if you look at this formula, if you write 1 by this, it becomes 1 by lambda naught, n squared minus 4 by n squared. So this becomes 1 by lambda is 1 by lambda naught times 1 by n squared, sorry, 1 minus 1 by 4. If you take, let us, yeah. If you multiply by 4 here. Okay. So this was the formula that he came up with. And if you want to talk in terms of frequencies, the frequencies would be related to lambda by this expression. Therefore, multiplying this by c, you get some 4c by lambda naught. The frequencies are given by 1 by 4 minus 1 by n squared. And another around the same time, Rydberg. So you usually pronounce this name as Rydberg. Yeah.
Sorry, I got the point. Sorry.
Yeah. So the correct pronunciation is Rydberg of Sweden. He discovered that this sort of an expression was not just for this 4 set of lines, but for any set of lines for any atom. Okay, so he came up with the general expression that it was
So your screen is visible.
hello, can you hear me?
So your screen is visible and we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, And can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, got it. Yeah, there was some disconnection for a brief. Yeah, okay. And Ridberry's discovery that all the spectral lines of atoms can in principle be written as differences of two terms of this form, where m and n are integers. Okay, this was a very major discovery, and this constant r, he also indulged in a lot of mathematical jugglery and fitting, and he came up with this particular constant r, which came to be known as Rydberry's constant. Okay, and again in terms of frequencies, these would become nu is rc by m squared minus rc by n squared, and you can label this frequency using two numbers n and m. So this became very evident, and this was discovered by Rydberry, and this gave a clue to Bohr. Bohr looked at this formula and he compared it with the photoelectric effect formula, which written a certain way, the energy of the electron, the emitted electron, was basically h nu minus phi. Okay, h nu is the incident energy, and this was the, you can call it the binding energy or the work function. So when this is a statement of conservation of energy, and the emitted energy of the electron or the energy of the emitted electron was basically a difference of two quantities like this, which also had, and if you write, you know, here you have a similar structure, you have a difference of two numbers. So Bohr immediately guessed that what might be happening in the case of atomic spectra could be a reverse process of photoelectric effect. So he conjectured that photoelectric effect and atomic spectra, spectral frequencies, may have related underlying process. Okay, so this was a very major discovery, and another very big clue that this might be the case was the following. By then, Planck had already discovered that the energy of EM radiation came in packets of NH nu. This we already saw. We already saw that this was the case. And what Bohr saw here was if you had h nu equal to RHC by m squared minus RHC by n squared, then this could be the energy of the emitted photon or EM radiation from an atom. All right, so far so good. All we have done is gone from 1 over wavelength to frequency, and we kind of borrowed Planck's relation and said if we introduce h into this, we get a formula like this. But it is historically Bohr's original discovery as to why this h has to be incorporated into the atomic spectral problem also, because h kind of made as a fit parameter, h made its entry into the quantum hypothesis as a fit parameter by Planck, but there was no motivation to connect the Planck's constant or to include the Planck's constant in the theory of atomic lines. This was not done for a long time until Bohr kind of saw a very strong motivation for doing this. And what was the motivation? Motivation for bringing H into atomic theory. The reason I'm bringing up these questions is because people don't think that these could have possibly arisen. These questions could have even arisen. But it turned out that it was not so obvious that to apply Planck's constant, which was discovered as a fit parameter to the blackbody radiation problem, into the problem of atomic spectra. It was not so obvious. But Bohr realized that up until that point of time, the two constants that played a role in all atomic theory sort of, you can say, analyses were the charge of the electron, because electrons were inside atoms, and the mass of the electron. Now, but using these two, there was no possibility of dimensionally constructing a length scale. What Bohr felt was, if I have to introduce this Planck's constant, is there any possibility by pure dimensional analysis, is there any possibility for me to construct a length scale? And if that agrees with the sizes of atoms, then we know that H has to play a role in the atomic theory also. And he could actually construct a length scale which looks like this. And this was possible only after incorporating Planck's constant into the fold. So instead of just two fundamental constants, Bohr brought in H. And using H, M, and E, he could now construct a length scale. And this length scale agreed very well. And we will see the exact expression in a few minutes. But just from dimensional analysis, he concluded that if we have H also taken into account, we have a natural length scale defined only in terms of these three fundamental constants. And that length scale has roughly the size of atoms. And with this observation, he concluded that, okay, then there has to be a role for H in our theory. And from then on, it did not take too much time for him to say that the Bohr's atomic frequency rule then immediately became an atom emits a frequency nu when it goes from one level denoted by one energy denoted by index n to another energy denoted by index m. And Wn and Wn are essentially the energies. Wn is the energy of the atom. Okay. So this was basically what Rydberg discovered. But from Rydberg's discovery, by incorporating the Planck's constant into the fold, Bohr made the statement that the atom was making what he called a quantum jump between levels n and m. Okay. But of course, other questions remained. This Wn had a formula, had a form. For example, if you think of it, this Wn has a form minus RHC by n squared. Okay. Whereas in the case of, this is for hydrogen atom. This is by pure analogy. Looking at this formula that Rydberry had and writing it in this particular form, Wn has to be identified as this quantity. Whereas for an oscillator, and what is nu? Nu can be square root of k by m, where k is the spring constant and m is the mass of the oscillator. Or nu can be 1 by square root of LC. Nu can be 2 pi square root of g by or nu by 2 pi nu can be square root of g by L. 2 pi nu is square root of g by L. Okay, so the frequency of an oscillator is determined by some parameters. The frequency of an oscillator is determined by some parameters of the classical model of an oscillator, such as spring constant, mass, etc., which are classical quantities. You take those classical quantities and you can predict the frequency. And once you know the frequency, you can write down the energy of the oscillator as NH nu. What Bohr conjectured was the following. Well, this form here doesn't quite look like NH nu, or it has a very different form from the case of an oscillator. Of course, the hydrogen atom and an oscillator are not the same system, so there can be differences. He had no clue how to arrive at this formula, but he conjectured that this Rydberg constant could have some expression. If he can come up with an expression for the Rydberg constant in terms of the parameters of the theory of the classical model. So this was the next exercise that Bohr did. And before he did that, he also made one very important observation. He considered this particular nu nm, or let us call it nu n to m, because this was the frequency emitted when the jump was made from n to m. Okay, and this was given by RC times 1 by m squared minus 1 by n squared. Okay, this was the expression. What he realized was the following. If you take m to be some n minus s for s much less than n, let n be some very large integer and s is a very small integer compared to n. And if you now consider nu n to n minus s, that will be RC by 1 minus n minus s squared minus 1 minus n squared. This can be written as 1 by n squared 1 minus s by n squared minus 1 by n squared. This is RC by n squared 1 by 1 minus s by n squared minus 1 minus 1. But when s is much less than n, 1 by 1 minus s by n squared is approximately equal to 1 minus or 1 plus 2s by n. Right? Is there anybody here who doesn't understand this formula? You have done this in Taylor series and in binomial expansions and all that, right?
Yes, sir, we did it.
1 by 1 minus x when x is a small quantity can be written as 1 plus x. Similarly, 1 by 1 minus x power n can be written as 1 plus nx. That's what I have written here. N being 2 and x being s by n. Okay. So if I now write this, the frequency emitted when the atom makes the transition from n to n minus s is 2rc s by n cubed. Okay. Now, if you observe this, this has a structure of s times some nu naught, where nu naught is 2rc by n cubed. Therefore, nu going from n to n minus s behaves approximately as s times nu naught, where nu naught is the frequency that Bohr interpreted this nu naught as the frequency in the nth level. And he said, you do have harmonics. If nu naught is the fundamental frequency, if you interpret nu naught, if we interpret nu naught as a fundamental frequency, then this atom emits harmonics s nu naught, s belonging to integers. So what he realized was that this general expression that Rydberry, Ritz, and he were looking at as a some difference of two terms which had 1 over n squared, this had the peculiar property that for very large n, it does indicate a harmonic behavior, meaning that these frequencies for very large n behaved roughly as harmonics if you consider transitions between neighboring levels. Now, Bohr had no clue what these levels were and etc. 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 But this was one of the simple mathematical observations. By just looking at this formula, he could say that for large n, this does have harmonic behavior. So Bohr came up with something called the correspondence principle. The first version of the correspondence principle that he came up with was following. This formula RC by 1 minus n minus s squared minus 1 by n squared became 2rc by n cubed times s. Therefore, for large n, the classical harmonic set of frequencies and the what he called the quantum formula of nu n to n minus s agreed. So this he wanted to exploit this simple observation to the fullest and see how far he could go. This is a very important aspect in theoretical physics. If you get a clue that something may be happening in this particular direction, you want to go as far as possible along that direction before you abandon that principle or you modify that principle. So Bohr took that route and he said, classically, you only have a harmonic set of frequencies. But the atomic spectra of hydrogen did not show harmonic set of frequencies, but they had this very weird form, which was a difference of two terms, which went as 1 over n squared. But this expression in the quantum case or in the atomic spectra case, for very large n has a classical counterpart and a classical correspondence. And it is this correspondence which he used as the central pillar of all his subsequent analysis. Okay. So here is what he did. Expression for Rydberg constant. Okay, expression for the Rydberg constant. And he went about applying simple classical principles, because in the case of an oscillator, the frequency of an oscillator was determined entirely using classical parameters, such as square root of k by m. So he wanted to do something very similar for a hydrogen atom. So what was a hydrogen atom? A hydrogen atom, by then already Rutherford and Nagaoka's models of a central positive charge of plus E and a negative charge minus E going around that were already known. Just that, according to this formula, the energies similar to the oscillator having energies nh nu, only energies of the form minus RC by n squared are allowed for an atom. Okay, this was something that Bohr kind of realized. And now he wanted to come up with a classical model which can predict the Rydberg constant. So he went about in the using simple Newton's laws. Let us say this electron is moving about with a velocity v. Then mv squared by r is its, and let r be the radius of the atom. Then mv squared by r is the centripetal force, and that has to be equal to some k e squared by r squared, where k is the electromagnetic constant, the Coulomb, the proportionality factor in the Coulomb force. Okay, you can write that as 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught if you want. Okay, or mr omega naught squared, if you write in terms of angular frequencies, will be, and you can in principle choose the units in such a way that this k is 1. It doesn't matter. So I'm not going to write k at all. I'll just write it as e squared by r squared, because we want some general expressions. So omega naught squared is e squared by mr cubed. Okay, and this gives us nu naught squared, which is the frequency. Omega naught is 2 pi nu naught. You get e squared by 4 pi squared mr cubed. Now, this is one expression. Now we also have the total energy of the atom is the kinetic energy, which is half m v squared, but v is r omega naught, right? V is r omega naught. So it is r squared omega naught squared, half m r squared omega naught squared minus e squared by r. Again, I am setting the k to be 1. I'm choosing the units in such a way that k is 1. And if I substitute this expression for omega naught squared into this, it's very easy to see that I get minus e squared by 2r for the total energy of the atom. Therefore, if you want to look at the radius, because energy is negative, and why is energy negative? Energy is negative because it is a bound state. Now, this is already known in classical mechanics. When you have an attractive potential, the bound state energies are all negative. That's the convention. So the radius of the atom is related to the energy as follows. Okay, so this comes from very simple, high school physics. that we have just done. And if you now substitute this into nu squared, nu naught squared would be E squared by 4 pi squared sorry, E squared by m into 1 by r cubed, right? 1 by r cubed will be 8 mod E cubed by E power 6. Times 4 pi squared. Yeah. So this becomes, by cancelling out the factors, I get 2 by pi squared mod E cubed by m E power 4. This is nu naught squared. Therefore, nu naught will be square root 2 E power 3 by 2 pi m square root m E squared. Okay. Now, this nu naught from correspondence principle, this nu naught is the frequency in some large n state according to, let us say this is the frequency when the atom is in some nth state. So therefore, this nu naught has to be 2rc by n cubed from correspondence principle, because he has to relate r to these parameters in the problem, right? That is the whole exercise. So what Bohr did now was he just took this expression 2rc by n cubed and the other expression which we just got. So you write nu naught is 2rc by n cubed. Okay. And if you now write this, and Wn is minus Rc by n squared. Okay. Wn is minus Rc by n squared. So mod Wn is Rc by n squared. Therefore, in terms of Wn, n can be written as n is mod Rc by Wn under root. Therefore, nu naught can be written as, by substituting for n in terms of Wn, 2rc mod Wn power 3 by 2 divided by, oh, this is RHC, sorry, by RHC power 3 by 2. All right. So now you have two expressions for nu naught, right? You have this expression for nu naught and you have this expression for nu naught. Equate them and identify Wn as E. Wn is E. Classically, E is the energy, but quantum theoretically, Wn is the energy. And he identified both of them and said, OK, let us set these two equal. And what you now get is 2rc by RHC power 3 by 2 will be some root 2 by pi root m squared e power 4. And by solving this for
Sir,
r, yeah.
how did we set omega, sorry, Wn to be exactly equal to E? Like this formula can be used to infer that they are proportional, but how do we set them equal?
No. That's not the proportionality. Here we are actually saying that Wn is the energy. So that was the whole point, right? That the atom has a particular energy Wn indicated by the letter n. And when it jumps between levels n and m, you emit a photon with a certain frequency. That was Bohr's observation. So when the atom is in the level n, it has an energy Wn. Classically, if you come up with a simple planetary model like this, the energy he took to be E. And he said that the atom is in some quantum level n with energy Wn, and this Wn is nothing but E. And using this, he now came up with an expression for the frequency in terms of the quantum expression for frequency has RC 2 RC by n cubed. The classical expression for frequency has 2 e cubed by pi squared m e power 4. So now equating these two, he felt that he could get an expression for R, which is an empirical constant. And that is exactly what you get. You get R equal to 2 pi squared m e power 4 by h cubed c. So what Bohr did, you can go back and look at this derivation. So in principle, what is Bohr doing? He's taking a simple classical positive negative charge under Coulomb attraction sort of model and assuming that this electron is moving in a circular orbit around this nucleus, and he is computing the frequency of this orbit, which is related to the energy of this orbit. Classically, he did that. He also knows, on the other hand, that quantum theoretically, that is from data in experiments, from atomic spectra, the energy of an atom behaves more or less as minus RC by n squared, RHC by n squared. Therefore, whatever is the classical energy E, it has to be equal to this expression minus RHC by n squared, which is Wn in our notation. So by equating the energy E to Wn and writing the expression for nu naught from the classical side as related to Wn and using the correspondence principle, this is the frequency that you get. This nu naught is 2 RC by n cubed. This is purely from that formula. Okay. By equating these two, he could now come up with an expression for R. Now this expression for R, by plugging in all these constants, pi is a constant, m is a constant, e is a constant, h is a constant, and c is a constant, he could easily compute this value R, which came very, very, very close to what Rydberry had empirically determined. That is the idea. The goal was to find an expression for R in terms of the parameters of the problem, and he did. The classical parameters of the problem, which are the mass of the electron, the charge of the electron, and other fundamental constants like Planck's constant and speed of light. Okay. And
Sir,
now if you, yeah.
sir, in the second last step, you have written square root of m square, and in the final step, you have written m. So if we square the LHS and RHS in the second last step, so shouldn't it be m square in the last step?
Let me see. I wrote it quickly, right? I might have made a mistake. Just go through the calculation once. I may have difficulty tracing back where I lost the factor. Let me see. Let me quickly check if this. Okay, this is fine. This is correct. This is also correct. That's correct. There is no doubt there. And then we have e squared by m 8e cubed. That's just this expression. That is also correct. Nu naught squared is this. Okay, I took the square root. I think I took the square root correctly here. That is also fine. Then I have, yeah, m squared e power 4
Excuse me,
Yeah,
sir.
I have. Yeah, sorry.
Sir, since we considered k to be 1 instead of 1 upon 4 pi epsilon naught, we have gotten 2 pi square. Like the actual formula has 1 upon 8 epsilon naught square in place of 2 pi square.
Yeah, yeah. So this is in Gaussian units. Okay, in Gaussian units, the electromagnetic force is simply the Coulomb force is simply E squared by R squared. That is how it is in Gaussian units. In SI units, you have the 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught E squared by R squared. So during those times, they worked exclusively in Gaussian units. Gaussian units have certain charm. The electric and magnetic fields essentially have the same units. And so it becomes uh, very convenient theoretically. Even now, theoretical physics pretty much uses Gaussian units. Only some textbooks insist on, because you typically get epsilons and mu's if you use SI units, whereas if you use Gaussian units, you typically get only the speed of light appear in the Maxwell's equations and not epsilons and mu's. So that's very comfortable. So I am trying to trace this factor of m. Let us see, 2RC to this and R equal to, okay, let me go from here. Okay, RC by RHC times RHC under root will be square root of 1 by square root of 2, because I cancelled the 2 there, and square root of pi squared m squared e power 4. Fine. Now I have RC cancel out this. So therefore H by square root of 2 pi squared m squared e power 4. Oh, this should be m squared. There is no doubt. It should be 1 by square root of RHC. I think that's fairly clear, right? Anybody has?
Sir, shouldn't it be m instead of m square? Because
Let us see. At least going from this formula to this formula, unless I made a mistake somewhere,
sir,
which
like m was in the square root, right? So if we square on both sides, then the power of m would be 1.
Yes, sir. I think in the
oh
second last step, you have written under root of m square. Instead of that, it should be only square root of m.
yeah. That was, so instead of bringing just the e squared inside the square root, and m was already under the square root. Yeah, m was already under the square root. That was my mistake. I think so. Yes. Anyway, go back and verify it once. Okay. This is not a very difficult calculation. So yeah, let me not confuse you further. Yes. All right. So Bohr succeeded in computing the Rydberg constant purely in terms of these fundamental constants. And this gave him a very, strong indication that, okay, Planck solved the problem of the oscillator using the frequency of the oscillator was determined entirely by classical parameters, and he computed a quantum condition. The energy of the oscillator is nh nu, and here we have something similar where the quantum condition looks very different. Bohr still doesn't know what the quantum condition, where the quantum condition comes from, but he knows that a similar quantum condition can be obtained even for the case of a hydrogen atom. Of course, further work was necessary before that could be done. And once he had an expression for R as 2 pi squared m e power 4 by h cubed c, RHC Wn became minus RHC by n squared, which essentially became minus 2 pi squared m e power 4 by h squared n squared primarily. Okay, and equating Wn to minus E squared by Rn to Rn, because classically, you see, I mean, this is the classical expression, right? The energy classically is nothing but minus E squared by 2R. So by equating Wn to be minus E squared by 2Rn, he could now compute Rn to be h squared n squared by 4 pi squared m e power 4. Me squared, sorry. Yeah, because there is an e squared here and an e power 4 here, so you get e squared. And if you plug in n equal to 1, now don't ask me why you plug in n equal to 1. Because after all, Bohr derived this entire formula for very large n. But at the end of this, getting this expression, he plugged in n equal to 1. Because when you have an expression like this, and you want to get a sort of scale factor, a length scale, n is a dimensionless number. So h squared by me squared has dimensions of length because the overall quantity is a radius. So this is the radius of the electron's orbit indicated by the number n. So in other words, it is the nth orbit of the electron. And that comes out to be some n squared times some fundamental length scale, which is some r naught. So to compute r naught, he put n equal to 1 and he got h squared by 4 pi squared me squared. And plugging in the numbers, this quantity came very close, very close to 10 power minus, if I am correct, it comes to around 10 to the power of minus 10 meters, which is around an angstrom or less than an angstrom. And this agreed, this value, which is now called the Bohr radius, because of this calculation that Niels Bohr did, the Bohr radius agreed extremely well with the data from kinetic theory of gases, the estimate of the hydrogen atomic size from the kinetic theory of gases. And what Bohr did was this very clumsy calculation where part of it was classical and part of it was borrowed from the experimental data from atomic spectra. And he tried to kind of force them together, fuse them together. And he met with remarkable success in predicting the value of R from an underlying sort of semi-convincing theoretical model. And he could also get the value of the radius of the atom, which agreed very well with kinetic theory of gases. So all these led Bohr to think that he was on the right track and that there has to be a fundamental theory that naturally comes up with quantum theoretic expressions. So at this point, we will take a slight detour and see what parallel research was going on due to other people like Ehrenfest, which gave some very important clues. Ehrenfest, Sommerfeld. There are several heroes to this story. Bohr, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger happen to be, of course, very prominent heroes along with Einstein and Planck. But we cannot, not mention these other people who made very significant contributions. So to understand, so what is the goal? So the question that remained in Bohr's mind is, En is nh nu for oscillator. En is minus rch by n squared for hydrogen atom. I'm now going to use analogous notations. This whole Wn business is rather not required anymore. So En right? What underlying principle decides each formula? We know in the case of Planck, we know this came from, can somebody tell me where did this come from? Adiabatic invariance, right? E by nu is an adiabatic invariant for an oscillator. So Planck's formula is essentially saying that E by nu is an H for any oscillator. So this essentially came from adiabatic invariance. So people started looking at adiabatic invariants for classical systems to see if they provided any clues. And exactly as they hoped, they did have all the clues, and Bohr could use that to come up with a general quantum condition. So let us now do a quick review of classical mechanics so that we understand how to generally formulate this Bohr quantum condition. So in classical mechanics, we are all familiar with Newton's laws and all these things, but there is another pathway. So Newton's laws govern mechanics of particles. Okay, and Newton's first law is essentially a statement of conservation of momentum in the absence of force. Okay, and second law is the equation of motion. It tells you that if you have a particle acted on by some net force, then the trajectory of the particle is given by this equation, m d squared r by dt squared equal to the net force. And of course, you have the third law, which in very popular terms is usually termed as every force has, or every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Or if you consider two objects, two bodies, then the force acted on by one body on the other is the same as equal and opposite to the force acted on by the other body on this one. Okay, and that is the statement of the third law. These three laws essentially govern all dynamics of particles. Now the problem in the sense of Newton's laws essentially boils down to computing what the nature of a particular force is. For example, people in history, they did, so what is F? What is F? So for gravity, F is some minus G m1 m2 by r squared r hat, right? And for Coulomb, F is some k q1 q2 by r squared r hat, where q1 q2 are signed quantities, etc., 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 and you have to have an expression for a particular force, and then you can plug this expression. Yeah, you can plug this particular expression. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can plug this expression into the equation of motion, and then it becomes a matter of solving an integral and knowing r at some time instant and r dot at some time instant 0, you can solve that equation exactly. right? This is the general scheme of things in Newton's laws. But a few years after Newton, people started asking the question, why Newton's laws? Is there any underlying principle? Is there a more fundamental principle? People had already asked this question in thermodynamics. People said, why this particular, configuration, or let us say you have a system. Why does a system reach equilibrium? When you have two bodies which are at different temperatures, you put them close together. Why do they reach equilibrium? The fact that it reaches equilibrium is an empirical fact. But if you ask the question, is there any fundamental principle? The answer becomes second law of thermodynamics, which says that the entropy is maximum in the equilibrium state. Therefore, the underlying principle of reaching equilibrium becomes that of maximization of entropy. So people were looking for similar explanations for why Newton's laws, and what people like Lagrange, Euler, Lagrange, and others, mathematicians primarily, they were looking at problems of this nature in the field of mathematics, and they came up with what is called variational calculus. I'm not going to, of course, explain this term variational calculus much, but the idea behind the variational calculus is what is called the principle of least action. Okay, Fermat, Lagrange, Euler, all of these very seminal mathematicians of the 18th century, they looked at this principle of least action. For example, in geometric optics, which was very, very well studied at that point, this principle of least action was already very well known and was used to solve several problems in predicting the path of light across media. Okay, so they applied this principle of least action to the problem of Newton's laws, and they said that there is this quantity called action, which is defined as the integral of a function, which is a function of r's and r dots and possibly time. And this action is an integral of this other function, which is now called the Lagrangian. Okay. And this Lagrangian, this is called the action integral. Okay. Action integral. Newton's laws can be derived. So what they observed was that Newton's laws can be derived. Remember, Newton himself did not derive Newton's laws. He only empirically deduced them. But here they are using a more fundamental principle called the principle of least action. They took this quantity S defined as such, and they constructed an equation of motion, which they proved to be equivalent with Newton's laws. So Newton's laws can be derived from the minimization condition. Okay, the minimization condition for S. And without doing the derivation, and if you want to see the derivation, I'll be discussing this extensively in my next course on quantum measurements. And of course, you will learn it when you do, as and when you do your classical mechanics course, those of you who take the physics major. So no need to worry about the derivation, but they figured out the following. Okay, so instead of these r bars and r bar dots, what they did was the following. Let q1 to qn be the coordinates. They called them the generalized coordinates. Now generalized coordinates are different from the Cartesian coordinates in the sense that x1, x2, x3 are the, say xyz are the Cartesian coordinates. You can have spherical polar coordinates r, theta and phi. Those are generalized coordinates because r and theta and phi don't have the same dimensions. Theta and phi are angular coordinates, but any point in space can be easily located either if you specify xyz of that point or if you specify r, theta and phi with respect to some origin. In the same way, cylindrical polar coordinates are rho, phi and z. Rho being the radius from the axis and phi and z being the polar angle and the z coordinate along the axis. Okay, so cylindrical and spherical coordinates were already very well known, and these are generally called generalized coordinates, unlike the usual familiar Cartesian coordinates. Okay, and in all these cases, the velocities are nothing but the time derivatives of these quantities. So this action integral is basically a function L, which is a function of the coordinates and the velocities. And many a time also time. Okay, so this is the action integral. And from this, by minimizing this, by minimization, they came up with an equation of motion which looked like this: delta L by delta Qi. Okay, delta L by delta Qi is equal to d by dt of delta L by delta Qi dot for each I. That is, for each pair of coordinates and velocities given by Qi and Qi dot, this equation is the equation of motion. Now, what is this L? The L is actually the kinetic energy minus potential energy. So this is the Lagrangian kinetic energy, and this is the potential energy. Okay. Now, why are we discussing all this? Because this is the discovery that they made, that there is an underlying principle given by this action integral, and by minimizing the action integral, you get an equation of motion like this, and this equation of motion becomes exactly the Newton's laws for this, choice of the Lagrangian. If you choose L to be t minus v, then, for example, if you take Qi to be just xy